day, thousands of graphic pictures are downloaded from the internet showing young children, some of which are just children aged maybe a few months, being sexually abused in the most deranged and damaging ways. By the way, if you have children at home listening, maybe now would be the time to tune into another station or switch off your radio. And while there have been a number of high-profile paedophile rings and ring-busting investigations regarding them, nevertheless, police forces are finding it increasingly difficult to curb the production and the distribution of this material. It is believed internationally that 1 in 4 children have been sexually abused in some way. 1 in 4. Think of that for a moment. That's a huge percentage. And a desire to record and spread this abuse is as old as the cave, as we discover in Ian O'Donnell and Claire Miller's book, Child Pornography, Crime, Computers and Society. Ian joins us in studio this morning. Ian, good morning.
Morning, Gerry.
Now, this does not make pleasant reading. It's dense, it's laden with statistics, with graphic description, and conclusions that are more horrific one after another. What compelled you for the need to tabulate this community in this way?
The origins of the book are in a piece of research that was funded by the Department of Justice, Equality and Law Reform 3 years ago, when they wanted to establish how the criminal justice system responded to the glut of cases that came to light as a result of Operation Amethyst in May 2002, when the guards were furnished with a list of Irish men who'd subscribed to a service in Texas. They were downloading child pornography, paying a subscription. The FBI passed the list of names onto the guards. The guards did 100 or so raids in one morning in May 2002, and suddenly the system had to deal with a problem that it hadn't really recognised in the past. As a consequence of that, we thought it would be interesting to test the extent to which the police and prosecuting authorities and judges had dealt with the problem. We put a proposal to the Department of Justice. They funded the research, and that accounts for the kind of statistical survey that's contained in the book.
Which is very valuable, by the way, I think, for anybody involved either in further research or indeed in investigating this.
I think so. Anybody who's got a kind of an interest in it as a police officer or a prosecutor or a researcher would be interested in that element of it. And then that led us to think a little bit more widely about why is there a demand for this kind of material? Where does it come from? Who's involved in it? What are the best ways to police it? What are the implications for society of the internet, which allows anybody to post these kinds of images and make them available to people all over the globe?
Now, I said that child pornography is as old as the cave. It has been there since day one, since people were able to record images and distribute them. Now, I suppose with pornography in general, there are people who take very polarised positions in relation to whether it's correct or appropriate or whether it has any use. But at least with pornography involving adults and what would appear to be even quasi-consensual involvement, we have kind of compartmentalised pornography into several areas, and some of which are acceptable and some of which are not. And I suppose that's how the human condition deals with it. And that's the adult world. And you can do that in the adult world. You could say, well, these people are compliant, they're complicit, and maybe it does even have a function in some people's sex lives. In other areas where people are being maybe held against their wills, where they're being raped, where there's physical violence involved, where the depiction of the subjugation of women or men is part of the pornographic message, obviously it's a very unsavoury thing and has to be looked at more than once and with a negative frame of mind. That's the adult world. There is no such leeway given in child pornography. We accept that. Now, it will never go away because it is a human desire. So what is the ambition of police forces internationally and society from a legislative point of view?
It's interesting to say that there would be no place in the world really today that would consider the publication, the commercial production of child pornography to be a legitimate commercial enterprise. That's a very recent development. In 1969, all forms of pornography, including child pornography, were legalised in Denmark. Sweden followed suit in 1971. And for almost the entire decade of the 1970s, child pornographic magazines and videos were being mass-produced commercially, and they were available in adult shops all over the world.
So and what was their reasoning there? I mean, it can't just be commercial, because these are democratically elected parliaments and governments with reasonable legislative systems. What was their reasoning?
It certainly wasn't just commercial. It was, I think, there wasn't a full understanding at that time that a child pornographic image is a photograph of a crime scene, that the child who's in that image can't give any meaningful consent, that it's a record of serious abuse and should be criminalised for precisely that reason. The liberalisation was because it was felt that this was just another type of sexual preference, that in a liberal world there's no need to restrict the people's access to this kind of material.
Just because you're offended by it, yeah.
Just because you're offended by it doesn't mean that it should be against the law to have it. And it's interesting, if you look at the late 1960s, early 1970s in Denmark, the first magazines were produced by a guy in Copenhagen. Willie Strauss was his name, who had an adult bookshop. One day a customer came in, gave him an envelope with a lot of pictures of a child being abused, which he put to one side. He was interested in bizarre pornography. A few weeks later, another customer offered him a job lot of paper in lieu of a debt. He decided to use the paper and the photographs to produce a magazine. He sold the magazine on the telephone, and this is going back 30 or 35 years. He sold almost 20,000 copies of it in a few hours. And in the magazine, the first magazine, he asked readers would they send in their photographs so that he could produce further magazines, and he made another 40 or 50, and they're still found in pornographers' collections today. So that's 30 years ago, and I think it indicates a different environment in which this kind of material was produced. It's unimaginable today that a businessman in any city, in any country, could start producing these magazines and offering them for sale.
Now, in those countries that you've referred to, have they changed the law in relation to child pornography?
They certainly have changed the law. In the late 70s and the early 80s, the legal environment chilled for these kinds of producers, and they made a rational decision. They were also producing adult pornography. They made a rational decision that while the child pornographic material could command a high price because it was in demand, it accounted for a small proportion of their sales. So it was a business decision, really, to stop producing this stuff.
And it was the poo on your shoe syndrome as well.
And there was clarity about what was legal and what wasn't. So when the law was changed, I think it made commercial sense to stop producing this kind of stuff. But just as it started to go out of circulation, I suppose, by the early 1990s, the internet arrived on the scene, and then it became possible for anybody who had cheap electronic equipment and a phone line to produce their own material, throw it out there in cyberspace and make it available for anybody else who wanted to use it.
Now, this is one of those occasions that those who support freedom of expression on the internet, this is one of those dark moments, and we're about to enter that conversation in a moment, because there is no doubt about it. It's absolutely as clear as the nose on your face that the advent of public access to the internet completely changed the landscape in terms of child pornography.
It revolutionised it, and it happened very, very quickly. When Bill Clinton took office, his first term as president in 1993 in the States, there were 50 websites, 50 known websites in the world. Now there are many, tens of millions of them. And the pornographers were one of the first groups to see the potential of these new technologies. They pioneered the secure payment methods. They pioneered some of the encryption techniques that are used to conceal images, to hide them, make them look like legitimate content. So people who wanted to use the new technology for deviant purposes were very quick to see its potential.
What it also did, of course, was it changed the attitude of those who wanted to access and those who wanted to sell pornography. Because if we go back to our friend Mr. Strauss, he was a businessman. He was selling pornography in the same way that you sell anything, and he had to identify his market. He had distribution issues, and he had a client base. Now, of course, we've seen that diminish.
Oh, absolutely. Now anybody who has a camcorder or a digital camera can make pornography, and they can distribute it globally at virtually no cost. And the other...
so it's the perverts feeding the perverts.
It's people who have this kind of peculiar kind of appetite who can now get in contact with other people who share it much more easily than they could in the past. And the other element of it is when magazines were being produced in the 70s and videocassettes were being produced, they degraded as they were copied. So a magazine that was put on a photocopier and then the photocopy was photocopied, or a VHS was copied in a third generation one, they were almost unwatchable. A digital image exists perfectly forever.
Now, as the internet developed, as broadband became available, and as the whole commercial dimension of pornography changed and the community became, I suppose, what you would call an interlocked society, co-sharing And of course, this is much more dangerous, in fact, than a commercial environment, because a commercial environment has checks and balances. It has bank accounts, it has shop fronts, it has windows, it has advertisements. You can follow it much more easily. It did drive, if not underground, it drove this much larger than we anticipated community into the background.
Oh, it certainly did. That to purchase a magazine or a video would have required somebody to go to a particular bookstore.
Yeah.
To order it through the post, to take risks in terms of purchasing, because while it may have been legal where it was produced, it may not have been legal where they wished to use it. So there were greater risks associated with getting involved in the trade, paying for the material, involved a risk of exposure and so on as well. With the internet, many of those risks are gone. It's easy to be anonymous. It's easy to access the material. There's a lot more of it out there. And even individuals who are separated geographically by thousands and thousands of miles, if they share this interest, they can communicate quite easily.
Now, do we have a definition of what constitutes child pornography?
One of the really difficult questions here is exactly what defines it, and that varies from country to country. In Ireland, under the legislation, it's an image of a person under the age of 17 engaged in sexual activity, or where the focus of the image is on their genital region. It can be text, it can be computer graphics, it can be a cartoon image. Everything is covered. In the United States, computer graphics and these so-called pseudo-images, computer-generated images, aren't covered. So an individual could have in their possession material in the US that would get them into serious trouble here or in Canada or in other countries. So the definition varies. The age is under 17 here, that's likely to move to under 18, varies a little bit from country to country too.
Yes, of course, this makes it a nightmare as to how and where, more to the point, you prosecute the user, the transmitter, and the creator of the pornography.
It makes it a really difficult law enforcement
Almost
problem.
Impossible.
Virtually impossible to deal with. Apart from the images which involve real abuse of a child, which are criminalised everywhere, it's really when you get to somebody who's used a computer graphics package to create an image of a child that may be almost indistinguishable from a child, where the age of the child is difficult to determine, where somebody has cut and pasted a child's head onto a naked adult body. Those kinds of images would be illegal in Ireland, but not in the US. So if somebody in the US had that material in their possession, it wouldn't be against the law. If they travelled to Ireland with it, it would be. So policing something which has a kind of a slightly ambiguous definition is problematic. But the hardcore images, the images of real abuse, there's no ambiguity about their status.
We're talking generally at this stage about child pornography, the definition of it, the changes that the advent of the internet made to child pornography. Of course, it hasn't changed the damage, because the one thing that has always been at the heart of child pornography is the abuse of a child. Now, there are people, obviously, who will use maybe holiday snaps of a child for sexual purposes, and that makes the situation even more difficult. That's another area as well, of course, because it has created issues for parents, who may have images of their children maybe in the bathroom. Is that pornography? Well, under Irish law it would be, wouldn't it?
It would depend on the focus of the photograph and whether it was for a sexual purpose. So a photograph that a parent took of their own child that showed them in the nude, if the court determined that was for a sexual purpose, it would be contrary to the legislation. But it would have to be defined in those terms. So
would that be from your investigation of the cases? Because you have looked at quite a few Irish cases, and surprisingly, I have to say, not a huge percentage of them being successful in prosecution terms. Would they have considered that type of situation? Because this is the spanner in the works for a lot of fellas who try to pretend, oh well, it was just a holiday snap. What are you talking about?
They have considered that, and there's a way, in fact, of classifying these images that was devised in University College Cork. There's been a project working down there for some years, and there's a kind of a scale of 1 to 5 that categorises images according to the conduct that's portrayed in them. And 5 would be sadism and bestiality and the most awful abuse, and level 1 would be these nude images that could be, as you say, holiday snaps or surreptitiously taken photographs of other people's children. So for those ones, it depends on the context. If an individual has a large collection of them, if they're carefully filed and catalogued, that might indicate the purpose that they've collected them for. If an individual has 1 or 2, it's their own child and they're clearly innocently taken, bath time snaps, that would put them in a totally different context.
And has any of this arrived in court? Has it been tested? Has the Director of Public Prosecutions resorted to this table of guilt?
Oh, absolutely. The judges draw on it quite explicitly, many of them, when they're determining what's the appropriate sentence, because they need to get a handle on what kind of material is involved.
How serious it is, yeah. Now, we now know, of course, that a number of things, right? One, this issue has been here with us for aeons. It will always be with us. This is never going to go away. You won't legislate it out of existence. You won't change people who are aberrant in their thinking in sexual terms towards children. But what you can do is you can protect the victims, the children. Mm-hmm. So it's also naive to imagine that this was not here in Ireland. Ireland obviously has probably the same percentage of people who suffer from and succumb to this aberration as any other country.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We just knew very little about it until Operation Amethyst. We had the legislation in place in 1998 because there was a concern about child abuse. People will remember the Brendan Smith case and the Joseph McColgan case. People will remember the Dutroux case in Belgium. So in the 1990s, there was a growing awareness that children were being sexually exploited in a way that people had never thought possible before. So we put the legislation in place in response to that, and it was ready then when we got this wave of cases as a result of Operation Amethyst. So you're right to say there's a desire for this material everywhere. It's more available now than it ever was in the past, but it's exceedingly difficult to find out who's downloading it, who's producing it, who's circulating it, and so on. We do know there's a vast amount of it in existence, and one example of that is in England a couple of years ago. In Leicestershire, a young man, an accounts clerk, was prosecuted. He had 20 million pornographic images.
What?
495,000 of them involved children. So now that's an extraordinary amount of material, no matter how you look at it. And if he was to spend 1 minute looking at each picture, it would be 38 years of unbroken attention to get through the entire collection. So the collecting is part of the pathology, if you like to think of it in those terms, but it also indicates if one man can compile 495,000 child pornographic images in a collection of 20 million images in total, that there's a vast amount of this material in existence and waiting for people to download it and to store it.
And of course, Operation Amethyst being our first, I suppose, point of contact with the distribution and the use and the downloading of child pornographic images, it turned out to be quite a successful operation and did result in prosecutions. Can you just take us back to that and give people an illustration? Because it was, in fact, the first interaction with international police operations, and the first time, I suppose, that the Irish authorities actually had a hands-on experience of observing, finding and prosecuting.
Yeah, absolutely. What happened was there were a couple called the Reedys, Thomas and Janice Reedy, who in Texas had set up a service whereby people could pay them a monthly subscription and get access to thousands of websites, some of them involving child pornography. And the authorities in the US found out about this. They investigated it. They raided the Reedys' home. They shut down their servers, and they found a list of subscribers from all over the world. There were thousands of names on it. They passed on those lists to the police authorities in a variety of countries. In the UK, they got several thousand. We got a list here. And the police then went and raided everybody whose name was on that list. That was in May of 2002. And then those cases started to come to court the beginning of 2003.
And we had the legislation to actually respond to
We
that.
had the legislation, we were ready to respond. And I think what people...
Did we have the personnel within An Garda Síochána and the DPP's office to understand what they were dealing with?
We did. The legislation was in place for some time. Yeah. The guards were clear what they were doing. They raided these houses. A lot of prosecutions took place over a very short period of time.
And some of them were quite high profile.
And that's why I think what shocked people, because this offence has been described as the great leveller, because the people who come to attention for interest in child pornography aren't the usual people who clog up the criminal courts around the country every day, who are young men from particular urban areas. These were people from all walks of life. And that's the same in every country where they have these operations. There are clergy involved, there are members of parliament involved, there are judges and lawyers and other pillars of the community. So I think what shocked people about Operation Amethyst was that all of a sudden they realised that the people who use this material are just like the people who live beside them, who they see going down the street, who they might look up to in certain ways. And then there was an issue about the sentences that were being imposed and how the system was responding to the strain of all of these cases. And that heightened public interest, I think, over a very short period of time.
And how did they decide what sentences would be imposed? Because probably the most high-profile case was involving a celebrity chef, and of course there was no custodial sentence involved there.
There was no immediate custodial sentence, but there was a period of community service in lieu of a custodial sentence, so as a direct alternative to it. And I think what happened with the sentencing was there was a variation in the kinds of sentences imposed, and not great clarity in the public's mind about why there would be that kind of variation, because people tend to think, well, if it's child pornography, the person should go to prison, there should be no ifs and buts, and it should be for a long period of time. Now, the legislation allows a maximum sentence of 5 years for possession of child pornography. That's the most usual charge.
Even level 1 child pornography?
Well, this is it. You see, the offence is possession. So if an individual had level 1 images, which were maybe of nude children, if they were only for their own use, if they hadn't been distributed, and so on and so forth, that would be at one end of the scale. If somebody had images of grotesque abuse and bestiality, they had lots of them, and there was an indication that they were part of a network for exchanging these kinds of things, that would put it at quite another point on the scale. And in terms of sentencing, we've seen everything from the full 5 years, with 2 suspended, right down to probation and a fine. And that reflects the variety of material that people have, the risk they're thought to pose, the extent to which they've taken part in treatment, and so on.
Do we know what was on those computers? Because we can all remember the news images of the various homes and businesses being raided. We saw the forensic guys from An Garda Síochána taking away the computers in the same way that they take away any item from a crime scene. We, I suppose, imagined, having watched CSI, that these computers were taken to a highly scientific establishment and viewed. What did they find? And did they have to go deep to find hidden images?
They certainly did. It's a laborious process extracting this kind of material and making sure that it's done in such a way that the evidence isn't compromised, that things aren't wiped, that the integrity of the material is preserved. In terms of what was found, mostly pictures, a small amount of video, a small amount of text, mostly pictures, from a handful, from 10 or 15 in some cases, to many thousands in others, and at all levels of severity, from the most minor, the level 1 ones as we describe them, right up to level 5. So the whole span of depravity was captured in these images. But an individual's engagement with it, some people may have had very few images at one end of the scale, some would have had many at the other, and quite a few would have had a mixture of various categories of image.
And do we know, were there guilty pleas? Were the cases universally defended? Were there explanations from the defendants?
There were almost always guilty pleas. And the prosecution rate is about the same as for other cases. The difficulty with prosecuting these cases is that it's not just to have the material in your possession. That's not enough, because any of us using a computer might be sent a pornographic image that we didn't request. That always stays on our machine, because if an image is viewed, even if it's deleted, a trace of it remains. The offence is to knowingly possess it. And this can be difficult to prove, for example, in a shared office environment. Difficult to show that one person had unique access to the computer. If there were very few images and they'd been quickly deleted, difficult again to say that that person knowingly possessed them. In a case where it's a large collection and is carefully filed and so on, it's easier to demonstrate that. So one reason that prosecutions didn't succeed was that it was difficult to indicate that the person knowingly possessed the images. Another reason was maybe that it wasn't clear that the material satisfied the legislative definition of child pornography. Sometimes individuals fled the jurisdiction and so on as well. But the overall prosecution rate was in line with the prosecution rate for other offences.
Now, as even in this conversation, as we progress through this story, it is inevitable that you forget about the children who are involved in this, the victims. They become, and I must only presume this happens to not only the abuser and the user, but it probably happens to those investigating as well. It's happening to us even in this conversation, where there's a kind of a blur of these children. And you have to stop and remind yourself that some of these children have suffered horrific, anonymous torture and death.
Oh, that's absolutely right. And this book is kind of an academic treatise in a way, if you like. It's marshalling the evidence and putting forward an argument and so on. But we were careful to return to the human story from time to time in it. And we give one case that we found in a book written in 1990 by a man called Tim Tate in England, where he found about a young girl who had died of a cocaine overdose in an Amsterdam hotel, who was being filmed for the sexual gratification of men who would purchase the videos afterwards.
Which she did
a lot. She'd been doing this for almost all of her life. died of the cocaine overdose. The police raided the hotel room, took her away. There was an investigation. And the really shocking thing about the case is that this little girl was 6. She was 6 years of age when she died. So that's the kind of broken child behind the industry that we're describing. And it's true to say when you start describing it in abstract or general or academic terms, you can sometimes lose sight of that reality.
Yeah, because when I read that paragraph, and it is absolutely shocking, I read through it and I went, oh yeah, somebody making porn films in a European hotel room, did it all their life, cocaine, sure, they're all at that, sure, died from it, well, sure, there you go, those who live by the sword die by the sword. And then the final sentence is, she was 6 years of age. And suddenly you are hit right between the eyes with the cold, stark reality of these children unprotected, nobody to speak up for them.
Absolutely. And
how many do we estimate are out there at any given time?
It's really very difficult.
Subjected to this.
It's very difficult to say how many children who are sexually exploited have that exploitation videoed or photographed or recorded in some way so that it can be distributed to others. But there's a lot of evidence that the scale of sexual exploitation is wide. You mentioned 1 in 4, the campaigning organisation in Ireland called 1 in 4. There's a similar body in the UK and in the US. And again, when these studies are done, these national studies of sexual abuse among children, we find those kinds of rates that, a quarter of young women have been exploited sexually and roughly a similar proportion of young men. So the extent of the problem is vast. And some of those incidents of abuse are captured on film. We've even got police investigations of live abuse, where people are abusing a child, it's being viewed by others, those other viewers are giving instructions to the abuser about what they'd like to see happen next. So there's a certain amount of that going on, but it's very much it's a tiny proportion of all child sexual exploitation.
Now back to Ireland, and probably the enduring belief, and it's a kind of a preservation thing that we have, I suppose, self-preservation to kind of imagine that, okay, so maybe there was a few dodgy guys and thank God the guards got them. But child pornography is probably produced here in Ireland. We are no different to any other country in our sexual predilections and aberrations. We are no different in our use of technology. If you use the computer to buy Abercrombie coats, you're going to be using it for pornography as well. It's the same in every country. It's only in countries like China where they've actually managed to physically legislate against certain websites and things like that. There's nowhere else in the world where they've managed to do that. In terms of protecting children, prosecution is one thing. Is it successful? We'll deal with that first. Is prosecution successful in protecting the children?
Only if the child victim can be identified, and that's very seldom the case. What usually happens is somebody's found in possession of this material. The material is deemed to be against the law. They're taken to court. They usually plead guilty and they're sentenced. But the individual victim whose images they're using very seldom is identified. So to some extent, the criminal justice response is important because it increases the risks associated with possession of this material. It does very little to address the victim's concerns.
And I know that they do, you spoke of the unit in Cork, who have, and continue to research this subject matter, and it's very, very difficult work because they're looking at some pretty horrific stuff. And they do try to see, do they see similar backgrounds and similar faces appearing, and I think they've even got software programs now that can identify that. But even with that, I think they would say it's very, very difficult to trace.
It is, yeah. There have been some police operations that have been spectacularly successful.
Such as?
There was one called up involving a little boy called Bjorn in the Netherlands, where they had an image of abuse in a hotel room. There were views out the window. They could hear the accents of the people involved, and they managed to piece that together to identify, first of all, the location, then the hotel, then who had the room, and over a long, long period of time to identify the individuals who were involved and eventually to bring them to justice. But that's painstaking police work over 6 or 7 or 8 years.
Involving one child compared to the fellow who had nearly 500,000 of them on his computer.
Oh, that's right. And the large numbers, I mean, one club that was bust by the police about 10 years ago, called the Wonderland Club, to gain access to it required 10,000 images, 10,000 new images. So there's a huge volume of this material out there. Victims very rarely identified. So policing and punishing are part of the response. I think another part of it is to reduce the likelihood that children will become vulnerable. The children who are used for this kind of material are often marginalised kids who don't have many people to look after them and to care for them. So that makes them vulnerable to exploitation and to the recording of that abuse. So while one part of the response is to address the people, the perpetrators, if you like, the people who are manufacturing this stuff and distributing it and buying it and creating a demand for more of it, there's another wider kind of response, I suppose, that society could take, which is to reduce the likelihood that children will become vulnerable in these ways.
Now, I suppose because we're dealing with the internet primarily, it is literally global, and there's no corner in the earth that the internet now with satellite transmission cannot reach. Is there one country or one region, though, that seems to present more of these images or originates them more than any other country?
I think Eastern Europe now is considered to be an area where these images are being produced. A lot of them in the past traditionally would have been Europe and North America. So Eastern Europe now, because the legislative environment, I suppose, is a little more lax, and when there are big police raids now, they sometimes involve, producers in these parts of the world.
And what would the Eastern European, because we're dealing with some of the accession states there, those wishing and wanting to become full EU members, what would their attitude, societal, be, and from a legislative point of view?
I think that from a legislative point of view, everybody's moving in the same direction. It's to define a child as anybody under the age of 18. It's to introduce really serious penalties for people who are in possession of this kind of stuff. But in countries where there is a lot of social unrest or disorder, or whether other policing priorities, maybe dealing with this kind of issue isn't accorded the same kind of significance as it would be here, or particularly in the United States, where there's massive concern about child pornography, where law enforcement takes it amazingly seriously, where enormous sentences are handed out, sentences that are counted in terms of hundreds of years sometimes to people who possess these kinds of images. But again, even in a jurisdiction like that, where there's no sympathy at all for people who are involved in this kind of trade, very few victims are identified and very few victims' needs are addressed.
In Ireland, do you believe that we have been successful when the cases have been identified or where we've been notified by international agencies? Have we been successful in prosecuting?
I think we certainly have, and most people make an admission of guilt immediately when they're apprehended for possession of child pornography. Then they seek treatment. So by the time the case comes to court, the individual is often a long way through a treatment programme. So yes, we have been successful in terms of policing them and in terms of prosecuting them.
Can you give us any idea of the number of cases that we're talking about, say, over the last couple of years?
We're only talking at the most, say, since 2002, of maybe 250 or 300 cases.
And did they originate in Ireland, or were they notifications from outside Ireland?
The bulk of them would be notifications from outside Ireland. They'd be lists.
What does that tell you?
Really what it says is that policing this is an international problem. The internet has no borders, doesn't recognise any jurisdictional boundaries, that for this kind of policing to operate effectively requires good cooperation between police forces across the globe.
Is there any good news in it, possibly, while the very bad news is that somebody has access to these images and a child has suffered to create them? Is it reasonable to say that maybe we don't produce them commercially, or we don't seem to distribute them as much as other countries, or is that utter naivety?
I think that would probably countries that have better access to broadband connections, that are more familiar with the potential of the technologies, would be the places where you'd find more transmission of this kind of material. Certainly people in Ireland would make these images. Certainly they would distribute them. I don't think there's any doubt about that. The scale of it, given that we're a small country, is likely to be modest enough.
Finally, Ian, is there an ongoing investigation comparable to Amethyst taking place at the moment? Do we know?
From time to time there are police operations. I don't think there will be any involving the number of cases that Operation Amethyst generated, because the Amethyst cases could be traced back to the late 1990s when people were subscribing to this kind of service, and I think few computer users today would be prepared to put in their own name, their own address, their own personal credit card details to buy material that was clearly illegal. So I think major international operations like that are much less likely now than they were a decade ago. Okay,
as you say, it's an academic and scientific view of this issue, nonetheless, even to the layperson, compelling and very frightening read. Thank you very much for talking to us.
Thanks, Gerry.
Good morning, Ian.
19 to 92. The Gerry Ryan Show, Monday to Friday, 9 till 12 on 2FM.
Now, you may have heard of the legendary Irish explorer Ernest Shackleton. In fact, the entire family are legendary. As we speak, another Irishman and his team are recreating his footsteps in the Antarctic. Pat Falvey is the fellow's name. He's an intrepid Kerryman and an explorer at large. And he joins us now from where? The Antarctic, of course. Pat, good morning and welcome.
Good morning, Gerry. How are you this morning?
Well, I'd say I'm a little bit more comfortable than you. Can you describe your circumstances, sir?
Okay, I'll describe it. Like, basically, we're 300 miles in from the coast at the moment that we're after skiing, and we're skiing to the pole. The temperature here in the tent is about 6:30, and we're just preparing breakfast, and it's minus 16 degrees Celsius. And basically, there's nothing around us for about 2,000 miles in every direction, bar ice. So we've had a very, very hard time so far. We've endured blizzards, temperatures going down to minus 45 degrees Celsius, and catabatic winds that's coming in off the pole at about 70 miles an hour. So it's been fairly uncomfortable, fairly miserable, and the total journey is going to take us between 55 and 60 days. So we're about a third of the way there. So it's at times it's been fairly miserable here in the Antarctic for us.
Well, that sort of makes your journey to adventure stories I thought I'd never tell. When I'm looking at all these extraordinary pictures of you, the Everest ones, of course, are the ones that I compare to your current situation here at the moment. That makes that, where you are at the moment, makes that trip up Everest sound like, a day out in the Phoenix Park.
Well, basically, every adventure is different, and on this one, I must say, it's one of the hardest things I've ever done, because every day we're like nomads in the ice. We pitch our tent in the evening, and then in the morning we actually take it up again and we move. And our goal is the South Pole. And all around us, there's basically nothing. We're in the coldest, most remote, most desolate place on this planet in Antarctica. There's no indigenous people living here. There's no crops. There's no wildlife. Like where we are at the moment, it's only in the coast where there's life. There's not even a lichen will survive. So it's very, very harsh. And as well as that, there is we can't relent. We can't lose our focus on the fact that in 55 days that we'll be at the pole, because, we have food supplies, fuel supplies, and, you just can't go down to the shop and get a pair of gloves or get more fuel and things like that. It just won't happen.
Well, of course, I mentioned that you were walking in the footsteps of one great man, Mr. Ernest Shackleton, and indeed his esteemed crew and his associates. Of course, we think of another great man, Tom Crean. And Shackleton had his woes on this particular journey. It's a dangerous journey. People die.
Yeah, like the thing about it is that, we're hoping no one will die. It all started with an ad he placed actually years ago. It was men and women wanted for dangerous expedition who may not return. And I actually did the same thing, and we had a TV series there recently called Beyond Endurance, where we wanted to take the likes of Tom Crean, Robert Ford, Patrick Hann. These are all Antarctic heroes of Irish polar exploration, and the unsung heroes, and actually see if we could get an ordinary person to actually come out with us here, myself, Dr. Claire O'Leary, to actually reach the South Pole and to finish what Ernest Shackleton had set out to do, and that was to reach the pole and to go beyond. And we had 32 people cross South Georgia, which was his great rescue for his men. The biggest group ever, Irish people, to cross South Georgia, from a 61-year-old who had a bypass to a 58-year-old mother down to a student. Wow. And out of that now, we have one of those people actually going to the South Pole with us.
And how did you pick that one person, Pat? How did you decide on that person?
Well, basically over the period of time, it just came around that the person that was to go would be the person that would have the most commitment. In other words, to do something like this, you would start and say, yeah, I'd love to do it, and it's fantastic. And at the end of the day, there's a number of things will come into being. There's the finances, there's the commitment itself in time. 2 years of training this person has gone into at this stage between Norway, across Greenland. We did the first crossing of Greenland there in August, so we have 30 days across Greenland, and basically many, many trips to Norway. So now what we have at the moment, we have myself, Dr. Claire O'Leary, who is the first Irish female to climb Everest and to do the 7 summits. And then we have Sean Menzies, who is the delegate from the Beyond Endurance South Georgia Traverse. And then on top of that, We have another guy called Jonathan Bradshaw, whose father originally hailed from Bandon, the same as Clare. And I met him crossing Greenland for a few hours, and I was just blown away by his enthusiasm and his story. And I said, do you want to go to the South Pole? This was in August, knowing that he could do it. And he's here on the team now as well. So this is about people pushing themselves. It's not about the boat. Like the story is beyond endurance, which is the endurance boat. But it's about people pushing themselves beyond their limits. And this is, one of the biggest expeditions ever to leave Ireland since, I suppose, I always say, like, since Ernest Shackleton, like, being an Irishman, but I know that the Brits will claim him as well. But in reality, to me, he was born in Ireland, and therefore he's an Irishman. So we're reenacting his dream of ordinary people doing extraordinary things.
Pat, can you tell us the kind of things that you're facing on a daily basis? The environment -16, super threatening, I think would be the best description. What are the things, ordinary tasks, I presume, become extraordinarily difficult?
Yeah, I tell you, like, -16 is the best we've got. Like, -40, like, we're averaging -30 at the moment, and we'll go colder.
Wow.
One of the big problems that we have is, I've got frostbite on the top of my thumb at the moment, and that was purely by actually my hands sweating and basically a blizzard coming up, like the calabatic winds coming off the pole and actually catching on my thumb because my thumb was sticking out. That's one. One of the greatest ones that we have, believe it or not, is going to the toilet. You know what I mean? Like, I could talk to you on a satellite phone, but it's actually one of the most difficult things here is the fact that you're on the move. It's so cold that when you drop your pants, and especially if there's a wind up, it literally rips. Like it's like being bombarded with hailstones as you sit to squat to go to the toilet, or even to take it out. Like as you're going along. We're going against calabatic winds, which is coming from the pole, and it actually comes up against your front.
Oh,
and
God.
There's been times here that you take it out to go for a pee, like, and it's like a bit of rock because it's it's so frozen.
And tell me this, Pat, you've hit a Gerry Ryan chord here. Could your penis freeze?
Well, there's a guy who was actually in the Arctic, and what happened, he forgot to zip up his zip.
Oh.
And he lost a 3/4 of an inch off the top of his penis, so he had to get it amputated.
And I presume, while the ladies don't have to worry about that, I presume for Claire, taking a wee is probably even worse.
Yeah, like, it's very difficult, like, for a female in those circumstances. And I have pity for the likes of Claire because, it's just you just don't want to go. But our setup then in the evenings is...
Yeah, what do you do in the evening? Do you have a bit of a sing-song? Does everybody get into the one sleeping bag?
Oh, I wish that was the case. I tell you, we're like cocooned in our own individual spaces. Sometimes, like, we go along for 8 hours in the day and we don't speak. We can't speak. It's so cold.
Yeah.
In the evening, like, it's the only time we have a sense of socialization.
Yeah.
So, like, we're literally going all the time. But the setup of the tent is, like, it's our front room, it's our bedroom, it's our kitchen, it's our toilet. Like, on the front of our vestibule, just to give you the setup, our tent is about 10 foot long by about 4'6" across. In that, we have our bedroom. Down at one side, like, we have an MP3 player, which, in other words, when you want a bit of music and when you're in your sleeping bag and you want to be entertained, you stick it in your ear. We open the vestibule and we set up our stoves right outside the vestibule so that we can close it to gain the heat inside, the radiated heat from the sun. And alongside of that, we cut a hole every night because of the fact that it's been so cold to go to the toilet outside. We try to limit our bowel movements to 1 in the morning, so that, in other words, we won't have to put down our pants during the day outside. And before we go, we try to go in a hole that we dig, fill that back up, get out, drop the tent, put it in the sled. And the tent is semi-erected once we put it on the sled and go, and we try to get it up in 2.5 minutes, 3 minutes in the evening so we can get in straight away and brew.
Well, I can tell you something, Sooner, you rather than me. You sound, mind you, for all of that, you sound in very good form.
Well, I tell you, I was fairly miserable there for about 2 weeks. Like, like when you start off something and then you're saying, will we get there, will we not get there? like there's 2 years of planning on into it, and we were kind of dubious. We had to acclimatise ourselves to the cold here of Antarctica, and we started in terrible conditions. It was some of the worst conditions they've got in 20 years, and like we were saying, like, God, if it's like this all the time, like we'll really suffer. We may not get there in time. And the sad thing about that is, if we run out of food 2 days before we get there, we're finished. So therefore, the logistics are absolutely enormous in relation to the planning of something like this.
When is what's your estimated time for arrival?
Our estimated time is the 3rd of January, so we have a lot of time on the ice yet, and a lot of things can go wrong from that point of view. But like this is one of the biggest adventures. Like in my in the book, A Journey to Adventure, like I have about it encapsulates, like, at 50 years of age, I sat down and I started looking at my pictures, and I said, it felt like I was living in a film rather than the reality of it. And then someone said to me, look, why don't you write a book, put your pictures in it about the place you've been, because I have 62 expeditions, been to the most remote, primitive, like lived with gorillas, Stone Age tribes, all around the world, learned about 20 different cultures, and basically what I did is I put a picture book together for Christmas.
And it's great, I have it here. It's right here in front of me, it's a fantastic book.
Yeah,
absolutely.
The thing about it, Gerry, is you spend so long writing it, right, and putting it together, and then just about it's about to be born, another expedition takes place, and I'm just afraid, I'm saying, what is the baby like? Is it good? I got one copy just the day before I went. I didn't even get time to promote it, so I just hope that the people of Ireland will like it and that they'll get on fire for Christmas.
Well, I'd highly recommend it, A Journey to Adventure. Pat, I'm going to take the news now and say good day to you. Would you call us, or we'll call you again maybe a couple of times between now and Christmas?
Jerry, I would love it, because it keeps us in contact with
all right, well, I'll tell you what, you do that, and the next time we speak, I'll give you any news that I have, and if anybody'd like to pass on anything to you. For instance, everybody in South Tip General would like to say hello to Claire, so do pass that on for her. And
I'll do that. And
I have to tell you, what you're doing makes my life sound and look and feel very mundane. We'll talk again next week, okay?
Okay, and enjoy yourself there.
Yeah.
By the way, I know it's December, so I look forward to Christmas.
Okay, God bless and go safely. I can tell you, that's impressive, isn't it? The book is called A Journey to Adventure, stories I thought I'd never tell, lavishly illustrated with wonderful personal photographs. Pat Falvey, he's at the moment in the middle of Antarctica, recreating the journey of Tom Crean and Ernest Shackleton. Yeah, I do feel a little bit dull compared to that.
Gerry